I'd like to welcome you all to this online edition of our ongoing speaker series in the Hoover Institution's project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region, an initiative supported by the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office that promotes research, teaching, and public understanding about Taiwan and the critically important region it inhabits. I am Glenn Tiffert, a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I manage the project under the leadership of my colleague, Larry Diamond. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Josh Rogin. Mr. Rogin is a columnist for the Global Opinions section of the Washington Post and a political analyst for CNN. He is renowned for his coverage of American foreign policy and in particular has been at the forefront of reporting on the dynamics in Washington of U.S. policy towards China and Taiwan. Among the many issues he has led on, I could cite the evolving story of foreign interference on American institutions, the PRC's campaign to isolate Taiwan, and of course the international politics of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most recently, he broke the story of U.S. State Department internal cables from 2018 warning of safety lapses in the Wuhan virology lab that is at the center of the coronavirus storm. Mr. Rogin was a 2011 finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists and the 2011 recipient of the Interaction Award for Excellence in International Reporting, and he appears frequently as a commentator in U.S. media. Before turning to him, I'd like to remind the audience to mute their microphones as a courtesy. I'd also like to direct your attention to the Q&A button at the bottom of your windows. When the question and answer portion of our program begins, you'll be able to submit your questions by clicking on it. Without further delay, I present Josh Rogin.
Thank you so much, Glenn, and thank you everybody who's joining today. And I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, and it gave me a very good reason to get a suit on for the first time in several months. So that was an added bonus. I think the best thing I can do up front here is to sort of take you through some of my reporting over the last few months related to the coronavirus pandemic, Washington's reaction, how it's affected U.S. China relations, and how it's affected the Washington discussion about U.S. China relations. And in the question and answer, we can get into pretty much anything that you want to talk to. And, you know, just for a little bit of background, I'm an opinion columnist, but I also do a lot of reporting. I'm going to try to be clear with the audience here, what parts are my opinion, what parts are my reporting, and when I'm mixing them around a little bit. But overall, the frame that I want to impart to you here is that we're all seeing, all of us, not just in Washington, but around the world, that the relationship between the US and China is changing very quickly. And not only is the relationship changing, attitudes in countries all over the world, including in the United States, toward China and toward that relation are changing fast due to the coronavirus pandemic and the Chinese government's handling of that pandemic. But we should also add a caution here that we're still in the middle of this crisis. We still don't know exactly how long it's going to last and what all the various actors are going to do. And we don't, so the end result, the end point is by no means determined. And so what I want to take you through here is sort of how we got here, and then what is going on right now, both inside of our administration and inside of our Washington discussion, and then sort of what the options are in terms of where we go from here. Let me start, I guess, from how we got here. So, you know, I think it's very important to note that bilateral relations between the U.S. and China were already on the decline before the pandemic, after 3 years of a Trump administration strategy to reframe the relationship and get at some of the fundamental imbalances and abuses that were largely ignored or downplayed over the last 4 decades of U.S.-China relations. And that story of the Trump administration's China policy over the first 3 years is one of, you know, internal conflict, external conflict, factional infighting, political infighting, chaos, dysfunction, relationship with allies, and relationship between the Washington and Beijing that fluctuated over time. And it's basically a story of lots of different interest groups, not just in government, but also in Congress and around the country, trying to weigh in on this fundamental sort of reorientation of the U.S. China relationship, and doing so in ad hoc coalitions, what I like to call assorted alliances based on overlapping interests, which changed over time. And this is all being presided over by a president who promised to fundamentally change the U.S. China relationship, but not in the way that any one of these particular interests or actors or staffers or officials really believed in. And he had a view of the economic relationship and how it should be changed. He had a different view on the security relationship. He had a different view on the personal relationship he had with Xi Jinping. And again, those views became sort of more understood by different actors and different institutions over time. And I think actually they're still misunderstood today. But anyway, all of that sort of led up to, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, up to a period of increased tensions that was actually set to cool off with the striking of the Phase 1 trade deal, which happened, if you'll remember, in a ceremony at the White House on January 15th of this year. And if you saw it on TV, you know what I'm talking about. It was a rare moment of real, happy, cooperation and all of the different sort of elements of the U.S. Government on China were sort of represented, and the Chinese officials were here, and they signed the deal. And whatever you think about the deal, and we can get into that too, the bottom line is that it seems that the tensions were cooling, and it seemed like there had been some sort of result of the Trump administration's strategy to increase pressure in order to get the PRC to change its behavior. Now, again, I'm not saying I agree that that result was what the administration said it was, but anyway, it was a positive moment. January 15th. Now, if you think about it, that was exactly when the coronavirus pandemic was becoming a very serious issue inside of China, and exactly when the U.S. government, exactly before the U.S. government sort of woke up to that fact. And that's significant because, if you, when I talk to White House officials, they always say the same thing. Well, in those meetings, in those 2 days of meetings or whatever, nobody mentioned coronavirus. We didn't mention it. The Chinese officials didn't mention it. It didn't come up, right? That's odd. Isn't that strange? I mean, you would have thought that this would have been something that they would have just talked about. But no mention from the Chinese side, especially they got on the plane, they went home, and then all of a sudden we got hit with the coronavirus. And that tiny moment of sort of, I don't know if you want to call it détente, of warmth in the U.S.-China bilateral ties is totally destroyed, and it's been going downhill ever since. And now what we know now, but we didn't know at the time, was that even at that time there was an internal struggle inside the Trump administration over the seriousness and need to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and what was going on in China and how it might affect us here at home. And I've reported extensively about this, and basically you had a security-minded officials, NSC officials, some State Department officials who were more tuned into what was going on in China and a little bit more tuned into the intelligence, who were sending alarms, right? And who were very adamant that more needed to be done and fast. And you had other officials, some who were protecting the president's political interests, like OMB chief of the time, or acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, some of whom were protecting the trade deal, like Steve Mnuchin, who resisted those efforts. And that undoubtedly cost us precious time. And of course, the president in his stance was, this is debatable too, but was in the mood at that time of cementing his new trade deal in friendlier ties with Beijing, and for obvious and clear and understandable political reasons, was resistant to the idea of believing that this was going to be something that would doom our economy, perhaps his reelection, and perhaps the trade deal that he just got finished signing. Okay, but we didn't know that on January 15th, but the various actors inside the system sort of all came around to that at different times in different ways. Of course, that you could take that and then you can look at how that spilled over into Congress. And I'll take this opportunity to tell you a little anecdote, which is something that was in my reporting last week, which said, for years, there's been a lot of congressional activity on how to confront various aspects of the challenge of a rising China, on trade stuff, on tech stuff, media stuff, you name it, academia. The issue of Chinese influence and interference operations inside the United States grew from basically no discussion, only a few years ago, to being discussed all the time and everywhere. And that's a huge change that's been building for a long time. And notably, it was not completely bipartisan, but there was a lot of bipartisanship to be found in it. I remember I reported on a bill, Uyghur human rights bill, which was co-sponsored by Marco Rubio and Ilhan Omar, who never agreed on anything. Mark Meadows and Adam Schiff, and you could just go down the line. There was an understanding that some of these worst abuses were so egregious that even progressive Democrats and hawkish Republicans could get on the same page. There was a lot of cooperation on the trade stuff in a different set of, again, assorted alliances. You had Tom Cotton and Chuck Schumer co-sponsor a bill on fentanyl. There was an understanding, if not not a totally functional set of cooperation, that everyone had an interest in doing something about some of these problems in the U.S. China relationship that had been festering for so long. And I think it's clear now. You can see that that bipartisanship is disappeared. Okay, but it didn't. That it started to break down actually before the coronavirus was impacted. And this is the anecdote. So I was for a year following this effort inside congressional leadership and to create a task force. They called it at that time a policy coordination committee, and that this was meant to bring together Republicans and Democrats from 10 different committees of jurisdiction to put their heads together and figure out the order of battle and priority and how to deconflict interests related to legislation on China. It seemed like something that everyone could agree needed to be done. How do you have 200 China bills and nobody knows which one's which? And does the Education Committee like what the Intel Committee came up with on Chinese infiltration of academia? Well, no, not unless they talk to each other. So this was the idea. And they worked on it, and I caught wind of it, and I talked to a bunch of leaders, you name it, Hoyer, Engel, McCarthy, the whole bit, McCall. They're all on board. And this was in February. And so I did a bunch of interviews. I thought, it's nice to write a good news story every once in a while. I'm not opposed to that. And the night before, I had the article written, the night before it was set to publish, I got a call from the Democratic leadership to say that this had to be put on hold. And why did it have to be on hold? Well, we don't want to get into it, but the bottom line is we had a leader-member issue, which basically means, my understanding is that, the leadership wanted certain members to be on this task force, and other members they couldn't figure out who should be on it. I said, okay, just let me know when you figure it out, and we'll just take it from there. Now, last week, the Republican side, led by Republican leader McCarthy, they called me and they said, well, listen, we've got this coronavirus thing, and we can't wait any longer. We're going to do it without the Democrats, which is sort of, understandable in a way. And then called the Democrats, they said, well, we were going to do it, but now because of the coronavirus, we definitely can't do it with the Republicans, because now we don't want to get roped into their attempt to distract America from Trump's terrible handling of the coronavirus pandemic. And I was like, okay, well, that's understandable in a way, but the result is that for political reasons on both sides, the main project on bipartisanship on China Congress is totally broke down. It's not going to be bipartisan at all. And, that's a huge missed opportunity. And, if you're looking a little bit deeper into Congress, where you have tons and tons of China bills, right? Tons of them, lots and lots and lots of them, almost all now strictly on a partisan basis. And, you have a Republican Party that's intent on blaming the CCP, and, I'm sympathetic to that argument. And you have a Democratic Party that's intent on avoiding blaming the CCP because it's as Nancy Pelosi said just yesterday, quote unquote a distraction from the issue of dealing with the pandemic. And I happen to fall somewhere in the middle. I think that we need to walk and chew gum, that we can be critical of our own response and critical of China's actions at the same time. In fact, we need to do both because our government's response is still very lacking, and Chinese government's response is still very lacking, and both of those things affect our security and our public health. But anyway, the politics of the moment don't provide for that, and that kind of gets you into the campaign. And it's obvious that in this presidential election season, the incentives for politicizing the issue on both sides go up enormously, and that's inevitable but extremely unfortunate. So you have the Trump campaign spending millions of dollars attacking Joe Biden his week on China, and the NRSC, I forget which one of the Republican committees telling its members, in a long memo, don't defend Trump, just attack China, right? And that's clearly an attempt to abuse the China issue for partisan purposes. And then on the Democratic side, what you hear on China is, on the one hand, some I think very legitimate and important warnings against increased threats to Asian Americans, and I think that's a serious issue, and we should heed those warnings and be very engaged with that community. But also on the issue of the CCP, almost nothing. Okay, and this reflects an internal division inside the Democratic Party, but also sort of an aversion to really getting into it one way or the other, because they don't see a real political upside, in my view, to taking a stance one way or the other. Biden campaign, same thing. First, they were attacking Trump for being too tough on China. Now they're attacking Trump for being too weak on China. It's muddled. There's no other way to describe it but as muddled. And we could talk about what that would mean if the Biden campaign actually wins, which is a whole nother story. But I think what all these congressmen are trying to grapple with is the fact that attitudes in America are changing fast. And this is first shown by the Harris poll and then by a Pew poll, which show that, Americans are increasingly wary of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, and are looking at its actions. And, we could go through them, but they're obvious for all to see, that have endangered and sacrificed our ability to stay safe. And, this is sort of the latest bit in a larger awakening around Washington and around America to the fact that, Chinese government misbehavior, both in repression and aggression and tampering and influence and you name it, corporate aggression, all that stuff, spying, was largely an issue discussed by elites in rooms in Washington and maybe in ivory towers in academia. And that's no longer the case. Now everyone's stuck in their home. Everyone can't see the grandma. Everyone's wearing masks. And everyone knows, and I don't think it's arguable, frankly, that missteps and lies and distortions and propaganda by the Chinese government exacerbated this crisis. I don't think anyone except for the Chinese Communist Party is even disputing that. And we can talk about how much it exacerbated it and how, what we could do about that. And I think that's a fascinating discussion. But all of the sudden, the China issue is relevant to every single American, in fact, every single person around the world. And that in a democracy makes a big difference, because in the end, lawmakers will respond to their constituents one way or another. And that sort of gets me to sort of the international piece, which is also fascinating. I spent a lot of time this morning talking to a parliamentarian from the United Kingdom, and he was telling me about attitudes changing not only in the UK, but also especially in the UK government. And when you think of an issue like Huawei, just for one example, the grand project of the Trump administration to convince, cajole, pressure allies not to build their 5G infrastructure with Huawei tech is not really going very well, frankly, okay, until the coronavirus pandemic. I mean, to have our Five Eyes partner UK come up with like a compromise that, oh, well, they can 35% Huawei or whatever, we won't put it right next to the military base, whatever rationale they came up with, that was a defeat for U.S. international engagement on the China issue. And now that's turning around, but not because of anything we did. because of what the Chinese government did. And that's huge. And so it's not just the coronavirus pandemic hasn't just changed the discussion of China in Washington, it's changing in every capital, in every town, in every country. And, one of the criticisms I have of the Trump administration is that they failed to have an international engagement strategy on China. First of all, that makes a lot of progress, but also on the coronavirus pandemic. And of course, since they're linked, their failure on both of those fronts is linked. I would want to get into the Wuhan Lab origin story, and it's a personal for me, not because I have a stake in the outcome. I really don't. I don't care one way or the other where it came from. I do care about getting to the truth of where it came from. But since I kind of got roped into it with that Wuhan State Department cable story, let me just say some stuff about it that you might find interesting and enlightening about the topic. So basically what happened was, the Chinese government had put out the story that the virus originated in the wet markets, and without a lot of real pushback or evidence or really reason to suspect otherwise, that became sort of the narrative, and most of the American media ran with that, and that was good enough, and for a period of time. But two things happened. One was that there were a lot of people inside the government, and now we know this, who always believed that story was shaky for a lot of really common sense reasons, right? They didn't that we could go into, but for example, they sanitized the market. They just destroyed. They won't hand over the evidence from the market. There were no bats in the market. Maybe you think it came from pangolins. Well, there's no evidence there were pangolins in the market. The bat. There's a whole list of reasons. But the point is that at least it raised the question in the minds of a lot of officials, and they started to look at these two labs, right? And the Wuhan Institute of Virology and the Wuhan CDC lab, which is right next to the market, and then other pieces of circumstantial evidence started to emerge, right? The Wuhan Institute of Virology, which to its credit first identified the virus as a bat coronavirus, the novel coronavirus that we're dealing with now, had the closest relative to it in their lab, which is not a direct link to that virus. They just pointed out to people that, like, oh, there's this lab is the world's leading bat coronavirus virology lab, and isn't that interesting, right? And so then you take that and you add the fact that that virus that they found, which is again not a direct relative to the novel coronavirus, but it's the closest one we know of, 96.2%, which is either very close or not that close, depending on which scientist you talk to, derived from a bat that was found in a cave in Yunnan, which is several hundred miles away. So it seems clear that most of these outbreaks do happen in the wild. At the same time, lab accidents happen all the time, including in China. At the same time, most of the outbreaks of these human spillovers happen in the rural areas where the bats are. Not to say there are no bats in Wuhan, but typically, if a bat virus from Yunnan would spill over somewhere near Yunnan, 1,000 miles away next to the lab. Anyway, there was enough sort of circumstantial open source stuff that officials started to have a real debate over whether or not the lab could be the source of it, an accident source, not a bioweapon. We're not getting into bioweapon. That's a red herring. I think that was an unfortunate straw man that a lot of people use to attack, to say that there's no chance it came from the lab. The bottom line is that at some point the administration decided that they were going to confirm that there was a belief amongst many of them that a lab accident theory was valid. And because the Trump administration has a credibility problem, and because they failed to provide evidence to support that, in terms of confirming evidence, then all of a sudden the intelligence community started to leak that, well, we haven't confirmed it, right? And that was presented as a sort of a rebuttal and sort of to disprove the lab accident theory. But if you sort of followed it very closely, you knew that both things could be true. In other words, what Pompeo was saying about the lab accident theory evidence, what he was referring to was basically the open source evidence that we all see. And I mentioned some of it, but there's a ton more, right? And he wasn't saying that the IC had confirmed it. He was simply saying that based on circumstantial open source stuff, we have these suspicions. And the IC was saying, well, through secret means, we haven't confirmed any link to the lab, which is also very true. So, in order to sort of really be honest about it, you have to say that both things are true, that there is a circumstantial case that based on open source evidence that this lab might have had an accident and that's how the virus got out. And there's also no firm proof that we can confirm to prove that case. And that's where we are. And of course, that's where we are because the Chinese government has shut down all publication of research related to the origins, quieted the scientists and jailed anybody who countered the official narrative and all of the other things. They haven't let anybody into the market either. In other words, the IC doesn't have any evidence to confirm the market theory, but you don't see that reported because, that's, I don't know why, but the point is that they don't know anything either way. There's an intelligence gap, and that's really important to understand. And that intelligence gap is not going to be very easy to solve in the midst of the Chinese government stopping anyone from actually investigating any of it. So again, I'm happy to talk even more about that if you want in the Q&A, but my basic stance here is that, the cables didn't allege that the virus came from the lab. The cables were 2 years prior. They just predicted that because of reported poor safety concerns at the lab, that a bat coronavirus might emerge in Wuhan. And so then when a bat coronavirus emerged in Wuhan right next to the lab, it was natural for a lot of officials to say, oh, maybe we should look into that. And they're looking into it, and they haven't found any proof yet. And again, we can talk about that more. Just to sort of get to sort of the where we are now and where we're going, I think because the political incentives and the discussion about the U.S. relationship with China is now changing so fast. Basically, what you have is politicians and congressmen and industry people and officials and everyone really sort of like treating the coronavirus pandemic as a Christmas tree. It's like whatever ornaments you already had, you just bring to the Christmas, you put them on there, you just dust off whatever you had in your closet. So, if you were for decoupling in the U.S.-China economic relationship before coronavirus, well, now coronavirus is the perfect reason to move forward with that. If you were for cutting off China from financial markets, or if you were for, restricting Chinese journal, or whatever it was that you wanted to do, well, isn't, that this is now the perfect avenue because it's caught the attention of the world. And that's in some ways an abuse of the issue, but in other ways, an opportunity for a lot of things that have been sitting on the shelf to come off the shelf and get some real discussion and debate. And, the trade deal, while it's still being tested, I mean, it's fair to say it's not going to be going very well. They're not going to meet their purchasing demands, which is the thing that Trump cares about. And they're not going to, it doesn't seem like, based on the news today, that they're hacking all of our research institutions for coronavirus data. It doesn't seem like they're going to stop the intellectual property theft or the economic espionage, which was the other part of the deal. So that doesn't seem to be going well either. So all of the sudden, for the Trump administration, preserving the phase one deal is still a political imperative, but preserving it to the extent that you don't do a lot of important things on China that had been shelved while we were negotiating the deal, that no longer makes a lot of sense to them. So I think you're going to see a lot of things coming out of storage. Okay, and you saw one today. And what happened today, and this is kind of gets us off on a tangent, but I think it's important, is that the White House ordered the body, it's called the Federal Investment Retirement Board, to cancel its plan to invest billions of dollars of U.S. Officials' pension funds. It's called the Thrift Savings Plan. If you're a troop or a federal employee, you have a 401k. It's run by this thing called the Thrift Savings Plan. And that Thrift Savings Plan was planning to change its investment scheme to track an index called the MSCI index, or at least a basket of indexes that are heavily invested in Chinese companies, including Chinese companies that are sanctioned by the Commerce Department, including Chinese companies that are committing gross human rights abuses, including Chinese companies that are committing all sorts of other crimes. And that was something that, you know, Wall Street and Treasury Department, and a lot of people even inside the administration thought was like, we can't touch that. Okay, we can't stop the, you know, challenge the Wall Street indexes from investing in China. You know, that could be super disruptive, and, you know, why shouldn't we want to, you know, have China in our markets, and why shouldn't we want to increase our financial integration and all this stuff? And there was a minority community, especially national security people, but not just national security, who said, oh my God, no, we can't do this. We can't tie our soldiers' pensions to the success of Hikvision, because eventually we're going to have to sanction Hikvision, and we're going to be sanctioning our soldiers' retirement funds. And they're not going to like that, because then they're going to have Hikvision's going to have a political constituency in the United States to resist sanctions, and that constituency is going to be the U.S. Army. How does that work? How can we invest our soldiers' future in Chinese companies that are bad actors and then try to confront their bad actions? It doesn't make any sense when you think about it. But anyway, that was a minority position for all this time. But today, they announced that they're not going to do it, and that was a White House decision. Then I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people aren't tracking, but I think it tells you all you need to know about what's going on in the U.S. China relationship, because that's something people have been working on for years, and all of a sudden it's in the realm of the possible where it wasn't before. And I think the coronavirus has a lot to do with that. Industrial policy, you know, I spoke this morning to Senator Rubio for a while, and, you know, he had a plan. You know, it was before coronavirus to sort of take this sort of Republican idea of you know, traditional idea of industrial policy and adjust it to the reality of economic competition with China. And that's not something that he just thought of in the last 3 months. He's been working on it for a very long time. But like I said, oh, well, here's the opportunity. And now every American can be like, oh, wait, maybe we shouldn't depend on China for masks. Maybe we shouldn't depend on them for ventilators. Maybe we shouldn't depend on them for rare earth materials. I mean, you could take it in any direction you want to take it, but that's sort of a socialization of the competition that just didn't exist before pandemic. That's not to say that Rubio's industrial policy is going to win the day. It just means it's got a new rationale and a new momentum. Okay, and let's see. I want to leave a lot of time for questions. You know, I think it's important here that we acknowledge that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, has done itself a lot of enormous and long-lasting damage through its response and its continuing misbehavior related to the coronavirus pandemic. Okay, and when you look at, you know, just, you know, the propaganda war, which we can talk about, which, you know, I think there's plenty of blame on both sides for that, but I mean, mostly on the Chinese side. And then, you know, Beijing punishing Australian beef farmers because their government wants to investigate the virus origins. Beijing refusing to sign off on the WHO inviting Taiwan to the upcoming World Health Assembly. Beijing refusing the WHO's request to send another team in to study the origin. They want to go to the market. Okay, you said it's in the market. Let's take a look at the market. You know, that we can't do that either. That was just this week. You know, that was just all those examples, including the hacking our research institutions for corona. That's just this week. You know, and it's been like that every week for months. And it's not going to stop. They're not changing their stance. They're not changing their behavior. And, you know, think about that environment and think of what that means and how we respond to that. What will the news be tomorrow? What are they going to do next week? You know, I can only imagine. We're just at the beginning of this, right? So as we look sort of a post-pandemic world, if there is such a thing, in U.S. China relations, you know, the Chinese government gets a vote in that. And, we don't exactly know what they're going to do, but it seems like their strategy is ramping up to be one of, again, increased competition, but also increased confrontation. And of course, there's a risk that hardliners on both sides could fuel each other into a confrontation that neither side wants. But I think that risk is less likely than what's happening now, which is just sort of a steady state of increasing tensions that doesn't boil out into like open conflict, but just makes all of the things that we're trying to do with China that we need to do much, much more difficult. And, and yet we still don't have a competitive strategy, much less one with our allies that can really deal with this problem or the relationship in general. I'll close by saying that, I think like there's, again, I don't want to just blame the Chinese government. I think there's a lot of mistakes to go around. Okay. And I think there's a lot of blame to go around. And, I think the media can come into criticism too. And, the China issue is new for a lot of journalists. There was a real problem with taking Chinese statistics at face value. But that wasn't the media being too friendly to the CCP. That was just a sort of a learning curve for reporters and editors who didn't really understand. And, quoting Chinese media without identifying it as state propaganda, sort of, failing to sort of look at the evidence that they present for its usefulness and for its, fraudulent characteristics, and trying to understand. It's very complicated, right? And even the best of us on a good day have a lot of trouble with that. But because this spilled out into the media landscape in such an abrupt and widespread way, I think it's fair to say that a lot of it was mishandled, but I do think it's getting better. I think Congress is not showing its best side. I think, you can file 500 bills about confronting China and none of them become law, then you haven't really done anything. And, the bipartisanship is really undermining our goals. And, I just think that, what the coronavirus pandemic has done is it's brought the U.S. China relationship to the fore of our foreign policy and in the awareness of the minds of every American. And that is, that's never happened before. That's totally unique. And that's going to cause a lot of disruption by itself. And, what I hope will happen is that, we'll start to have this national discussion about how to deal with the strategic challenge of a rising China, with the understanding that it's no longer a problem to be dealt with by elites, but it really is a problem that affects all Americans, American businesses, tech, media, Hollywood, academia, research institutions, all of it, okay? And my aspiration, and I'll try to end on a positive note, is that somehow we all figure out how to have that national discussion in a constructive way. I have to admit that we're not quite there yet.
Thank you very much, Josh. I wonder, while we wait for our audience to use the Q&A button at the bottom of their windows to file questions for you, I wonder if I can use the moderator's prerogative to pose the first one. And that is, some of your reporting in the last couple of weeks has taken up the issue of Taiwan front and center, and in particular, how the COVID-19 in a way has changed the dynamics of the U.S. Taiwan China triangle. I was wondering if you think that this new moment has changed the bipartisan politics of Taiwan on the Hill and in DC, has changed the debate within the foreign policy community on how much support the U.S. is willing to publicly make for Taiwan, and whether you think that the game has changed fundamentally.
Sure, it's a great question. So I think in Congress, there's always been a ton of bipartisan support for stronger ties and stronger support of Taiwan. Again, mostly because the lawmakers who really weighed in on it were ones that cared about it for already. So, you didn't find a lot of people, at least publicly, who would be like, oh no, screw Taiwan. That's not really, there's no real political upside in that. The problem in the last 3 years has always been inside the administration. And, it was very clear from the early beginning, and I reported this at the time, that after the backlash President Trump got from the call he took on December 9th, 2016, I'm sorry, it might be December 2nd, don't quote me on that. Anyway, really early in the transition from President Tsai, which he took, just because he's Trump and he wanted to take it and he didn't think it through, and caused him to sour on the idea of doing lots of public things with Taiwan for 3 years. And that, again, placed sort of a cap on the Taiwan policy. A lot of pro-Taiwan officials inside the Trump administration, John Bolton, Randy Shriver, you name it. Okay, we're trying to do a lot of good things, and they did a lot of stuff. They just couldn't talk about it, right? And the stuff they couldn't do was limited to this level, where it wouldn't disrupt the president's well understood aversion to do anything public to support Taiwan, and the congressional sort of bills just churned and churned and churned. So what's happened again, sort of with Taiwan is the same thing that's happened a lot with the Wall Street stuff and the pension stuff, is that ceiling of what the officials are able to get away with or able to push forward has now risen, okay, and the aperture is wider, and so I think you see that with the Taipei Act, and that President signed the Taipei Act. Guess what? The U.S. China relationship didn't crash. You know what I mean? The required protestations were made, and then everyone went on living with their life. But it's still a lot less than what you would have expected from an administration that's so intent on, full of so many pro-Taiwan officials. And then you have the WHO stuff and the masks and in the coronavirus, and it's like very hard to deny that Taiwan has been a very positive actor and was maligned and mistreated throughout this crisis by all the international organizations, and is now facing increased military pressure from Beijing, in addition to all of the interference and political manipulation and pressure they subject them to on a daily basis. Now they're going to ramp up the military tensions in the middle of the crisis. What's that about, right? So all of a sudden the Trump administration, again, the aperture is raised, so you can have a Secretary of State Pompeo publicly declaring the WHO must admit Taiwan to the World Health Assembly, and that's the U.S. position. Great, okay, it didn't happen, right? But 2 years ago, we didn't protest. When they kicked them out the first time, we didn't protest, right? At least not in this kind of a public way. So again, you see a raised aperture, you see a raised tolerance in the Trump administration for doing things to support Taiwan, but the results aren't there. All right, what did we do? Okay, well, we got a joint statement with some other open societies to support Taiwan. It didn't move the needle because it's essentially a day late and a dollar short. Now, they still have 6 months left to do something good for Taiwan. Let's wait and see.
Can I follow up, Josh, specifically about that by asking whether you see any prospects at all in the near to medium term for completing a free trade agreement with Taiwan, the U.S. and Taiwan, since that's been in negotiation, and what other concrete dimensions to enhancement of the relationship might be feasible now that the aperture is widened?
Yeah, so on free trade agreement, I mean, for the last 3 years, I've heard nothing but promises of free trade agreements. Let me rattle off the countries: Pakistan, Turkey, Great Britain, Japan, Taiwan. They've got a ton of free trade agreements, negotiations on paper. None of them have done anything. I mean, the truth of the matter is that when the Trump administration abandoned TPP to pursue a strategy of one by one, Trump likes to say we're going to do them one by one, one by one. Well, they don't have 1,000 people to do these free trade agreements. They got a very small group of people, and they were working on the new NAFTA and the China trade deal with almost all their time. And so I haven't seen any real evidence that real progress has been made with Taiwan on a free trade agreement, and I'm not convinced that that's near the top of their priority list. I think they would probably do the UK first, and then God knows what else. And anyway, all of that is conditioned on the fact, on the prospect of Trump being reelected, because there's no more space before the election, and nothing's going to happen. So I would just be skeptical of any real progress on a free trade agreement with Taiwan anytime soon. Although I think there is some sort of benefit to talking about it, at least socializing the idea, and at least telling them that they deserve it, which makes them feel better, but doesn't actually get them what they want. Underneath that, there's a ton of stuff that we could do. And this was in my column last week. Senior level visits, increased putting real meat on the bone of a strategy to get them into international organizations. What about a coronavirus pandemic cooperation, right? Doesn't that seem like an obvious thing we could do with them? Since they did the best in the pandemic of the entire world because they had the most experience with China and they've been through SARS and they they gave us the real information. What if we put a coronavirus pandemic coordination center in Taipei? How about that? That's an idea. What if we just started to send a bunch of senior U.S. officials there? That would be nice. It's not a big deal, but it's something. What if we started coordinating with them on Chinese interference and influence operations? When I was in Taipei last, which was last year, mid 2019, they're grappling with the same issues that we're grappling with. Okay, all of them. Chinese interference in their media, in their institutions, in their academic institutions, espionage, and they're begging for. They're like, hey, help us help you, help us. Why don't we just put our minds together? We're not doing much of that at all. It seems crazy to me. So there's a few right off the bat.
We had a reporter, Josh, who wanted to return your focus to the first question
Sure.
and ask you to look into your crystal ball and predict what might happen next week with regard to the World Health Assembly. Do you think Taiwan will make it over the hump? Do you think the building consensus? Okay.
I mean, didn't they announce it? I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in WHO parliamentary procedure, but it seems pretty clear to me that the WHO said no, and that means that Beijing said no, which again wasn't always their position. Remember, Taiwan was part of the World Health Assembly for a lot of years until 2016, when Beijing just decided not to do it anymore. The reason they were added in 2005 was because of SARS, because the world recognized it, and Beijing had to admit that it was egregious to exclude them in the wake of SARS, and that was the attitude of the Chinese leaders in Beijing at the time, and those not the same Chinese leaders we're dealing with today, and they don't see it that way, and they don't care if we don't like it, and the WHO is clearly not in a position to, or it doesn't want to stand up to them, and so I don't see that changing at all, frankly.
Great, thank you. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the team that you see in the Biden camp advising on China, and what we might expect from them.
Sure, it's fascinating actually because caveat is campaigns and administrations don't necessarily match. Okay, there's we have a shorthand where we try to look at a campaign and predict what the administration is going to do. Well, I don't think I need to lay out the case that almost every single time proves not to be the case. So with that caveat in place, here's what I see. Basically what you have right now is foreign policy as a focus of the Biden campaign in a way that most campaigns don't. They believe that he has an argument to make and that Trump is vulnerable on this issue, and they decided early on to make that a feature. And it wasn't focused on China, of course, at the beginning, but it's part of the Vice President Biden's argument for experience and a return to normalcy and a return to America's traditional role in the world, and a type of, not exactly the same, but a type of internationalism based on the liberal world order that Joe Biden preached about for all those years, inconsistently maybe, but sure, and it's also a reflection of the people who are really influential in this campaign. And I'm thinking right now of, for example, Antony Blinken, but a lot of others who are, devotees and come from this tradition of liberal internationalists, and again, more or less, and with variations. But they're not advocating for like a Bernie Sanders wholesale change in the Democratic platform on foreign policy. They're advocating for some sort of return to the traditional role of America in the world, and with, of course, an increased focus on multilateralism, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you dive deep down into the China hands that are associated with Biden, right, we have to say that they're not in control of the campaign, right? Have you ever seen one of these huge campaigns? Like every single one's the same. They have like 500 people writing like memos on Apple's subsidies in Japan that nobody ever reads, and they're having Zoom calls about well, what should we do about like India solar energy? You know what I mean? Like if they get into office, all that, none of that stuff matters anyway. But it's like a good exercise. People getting to know each other and auditioning for jobs and stuff. And if you look at the people, and I'm gonna refrain from like naming some of them right now because I think they couldn't possibly like that. But the bottom line is that you have some traditional Obama, China NSC guys who are very pro engagement, who saw all the China hawks as like dangerous Cold Warriors, blah, blah, blah. And then you have others who are served in different parts of the Obama administration or didn't serve in the Obama administration at all, who are much more sort of attuned to the competitive nature of the relationship. And I'm an opinion columnist. I'm happy to admit, right here, right now, that I'm more sympathetic to that camp, right? I think we need to avoid confrontation, but we need to compete better, right? And that is a separate camp of Biden China people, okay? And that conflict inside the Biden campaign is unresolved, okay? And it won't be resolved until or unless he actually becomes the president. Then they have to fight it out, okay? And that will be fascinating to watch, and I'm sure it'll be chaotic, and I hope to report on all of it if he wins. But what we can see with our eyes is that Biden goes back and forth, right? And, the travel ban to China was xenophobic, and now Trump was too tough on China, and now Trump was too weak in China. So they're pivoting, and they're watching the polls, and they're trying not to get outflanked on the China issue, and they're having a lot of trouble with that, frankly. So their case for China is very simple, that we need to be competitive and internationalize the effort, and take away the worst parts of what the Trump administration has done and focus on the best parts, which is a common sense thing that most Americans can wrap their heads around. But how does that apply to tariffs? Do you think a Biden administration would take off Trump's tariff? There's still a bunch of tariffs left, even after. Are they going to get rid of those on day one? Does that make any sense? No, because you'd just be giving up a bunch of leverage on China for nothing. So there's an understanding inside the Biden campaign that tariffs are useful, but they're not wedded to it, and they're anti-trade war. So eventually you could make a prediction that they would get rid of the tariffs, hopefully in exchange for something. Hopefully that something would be something real. So these are a lot of questions, and I guess I'll just come around to answer it the way that I started, is that there's a tension inside the Biden campaign on China that isn't resolved and won't be resolved until or unless they get into office.
Great. I was wondering, also, China, after riding high for a year on its global push and propaganda, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia, even Latin America, has suffered some serious setbacks as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And to the extent that the U.S. now has an opportunity to compete, as you said, where your sympathies lie, I was wondering if you're getting a sense within the Beltway that this moment presents an opportunity for the U.S. to step back in and get back into the game.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's a huge opportunity that we are missing. Okay, I mean, look at the $3 trillion bill that Nancy Pelosi unveiled yesterday. You know how much money is in there for international programs that might compete with all of China's international? Zero. And, I mean, there's some language about global health security, but without any funds attached, which is really the only important thing, right? Then the last $3 trillion stimulus bill that already passed, there was $1.5 billion in international assistance, and almost all of that was for like making sure USAID people, can survive, wherever they're stationed, or come home if they want to, or that we can evacuate Peace Corps people so they don't get corona. And then you have the Trump administration, which, to its credit, has given hundreds of millions of dollars to international organizations fighting the pandemic, but which as well, it's more than any other country has given, but that's just money that goes to like these international organizations, not the WHO anymore, but other international organizations. What about the competition? What about building up health infrastructure in these countries, doing all the things that might mitigate the risks of the virus there, so that we can still go to those countries, so that those people can still come here, so that the only person knocking on the door isn't like the Chinese government saying, hey, remember that debt payment? We're going to need that in 6 months, or we're going to take your port, which is what's happening. So yes, I think there's like huge missing piece of our coronavirus response and the international assistance. And it's a tragedy. I mean, right, we're just printing money, right? It's like $6 trillion. We're going to have to figure that out later. You can't give a few billion to stopping coronavirus outside of our shores. And the bottom line is that, congressional leadership doesn't want to put their members in any position where they have to defend any part of the stimulus that they don't actually have to defend. So they see it as just like a problem. Oh, who wants to go to New Jersey and be like, oh, get a question from a constituent. Oh, how come you spent this dollar in Uganda and not here in New Jersey? But we've had a long tradition of taking 1% of our budget and for foreign assistance out of a recognition that it's both a strategic and advantage, and it's in our national interest, and in this case, in our direct public health interest. 1% of 6 trillion, 60 billion, right? And what do we do? 1 billion. So I mean, it's just a shame.
Josh, the deficient masks, the grotesque lies in Chinese propaganda, the heavy pushing and intimidation in international arenas, these are all things that are fairly visible and that are coming more and more to the fore. I think there's another dimension of Chinese sharp power projection that's been more subtle and under the radar screen and presents a greater long-term danger to the liberal international order, which is China's, and it's not only China, I think there's actually an authoritarian project on this globally, penetration of international organizations and forums, and efforts to rewrite the international rules and really, in a deeper, more lasting way, tear down the liberal international order. There's a very good article by the University of Chicago law professor Tom Ginsburg on this rise of authoritarian international legalism and rule writing. But the penetration of the UN agencies and system has been very sophisticated and adroit and not very well noticed. So is it on your radar screen? Do you find it's on the radar screen of American and allied officials?
Yeah, I've been writing extensively about this for many years, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. My first thought is like, okay, if you want to present it in the most benign, sort of forgiving way, what you could say, and this, I'm not saying this is my view, but I'm just, for the sake of having an honest discussion, you could say that, well, the Chinese government has done an actually amazing job at engaging these international institutions and building relationships, often corruptly, to be sure, and to get into positions of control in these international organizations, from the UN to the Interpol to the World Intellectual Property, you name it, all down the line, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is what a great power is supposed to do. You want to increase your power and influence on a multilateral basis. And we don't do that, right? Because every 4 or 8 years, we switch to a stance of, oh, screw those organizations, and we're taking our toys, picking up our toys, and we're going home, right? So which is the smarter strategy? Isn't it smarter just to give them credit just for a second, and then I'll bash them in a second? Isn't it smarter to just to do what great powers do, which is to exert their power in these multilateral institutions? That's exactly what China has done. Again, using the most corrupt means. Now, what they've done with that power is hugely problematic, as you noted, because what they're doing is to reshape those organizations and, in a sense, reshape the international norms and rules that those organizations are built on to their interest, okay? And in many cases, and not all cases, that's adverse to our interests, especially in their view. So, if you look at so it's a much bigger issue. If you look at the international human rights, okay, and yeah, the Human Rights Council is terrible, and how can Saudi Arabia be? All those criticisms are valid, right? But what the Chinese government has done is actually much more insidious, in the sense that it's trying to reorient the definition of human rights towards one that doesn't stop them from putting 3 million Uyghurs in camps, and God knows all the other horrible stuff that they're doing on the human rights front. And that kind of attitude shifting is almost as important, if not more important, than the control over the mechanisms themselves. And you could take that all the way down the line. But there has been a pushback. It has been late. The World Intellectual Property Organization example is instructive here. What happened was, it seemed clear that a Chinese official was going to take over as Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization, because the Chinese government was doing both a overt and covert, both public and corrupt campaign to install this person. And it was so egregious to think of the world's leading thief of intellectual property to be in control of the World Intellectual Property Organization. The consequences of that are so mind-boggling. Like, what are we not going to have patents anymore? How do you even? It's like, I compared it in a column. It's not like letting the fox into the henhouse. It's like letting a bank robber be president of the bank, right? It was so crazy that there was an effort, and the Trump administration, to its credit, engaged in that effort, and the Chinese official lost the election, and but that's one, right? And I can name you 7 others that went the other way, right? So I mean, we can't walk away from multilateralism and complain about our lack of success in the multilateral forums at the same time. It's just too dissonant, right? So that's one thing. And as for your sort of premise that of an authoritarian-led world order, well, I think what I would say to that is that, like, I think it's become clear to me over the years that the Chinese Communist Party was sort of like treated international engagement as a train that takes you to a place, and then when you get to that place, you get off. Okay, and they're happy to play in our sandbox as long as it serves their interests, as long as they're able to achieve their objectives, and if that means changing the nature of those organizations, all the better. But when push comes to shove, those are not going to be the places where we're able to confront the authoritarian tendencies of the PRC. In fact, I don't necessarily believe that we're going to change the PRC fundamentally from its authoritarian tendencies one way or the other, which again points to a competitive strategy that's based on our own health, economic health, security health, our resilience, our response, our defense, and ultimately it makes perfect sense that we should do that with like-minded countries, and those like-minded countries happen to be democratic, free, and open societies. And that's the better argument. It's clear that that's the better argument. The fact that we're losing that argument in all these institutions is a reflection of how poorly we're doing in making that argument.
Thank you, Josh. I was wondering if you could comment on the dynamics of the moment, where fireworks at the official level between Washington and Beijing are flying over the COVID-19 pandemic. To what extent do back channels remain open that hold out some prospect of lowering the temperature, whether among within the administration, Congress, think tanks, universities, track 1.5, track 2? Has the space there generally constricted? What are you hearing from your perspective on the ground in DC?
Sure. I think there's 2 things. One is that, not through back channels, but through front channels, there's still a lot of engagement, and a lot, actually. And, some of that is by the people who are most closely tied to the trade deal. I think you saw, a week or 2 ago, an announcement, positive joint statement put out by Mnuchin and I believe Lighthizer, but I'm not sure. But, basically saying that, like, don't worry, everything's going to be okay, and actually trade deal is going really well. So there's still a lot of engagement on a lot of levels. What I hear, and I feel silly telling an audience of academics this, but what I hear is that the academic interactions have been severely curtailed, mostly from the Chinese side, and that the space for real dialogue amongst Chinese think tanks and even open discussion has shrunk enormously well before coronavirus, and that's a huge problem. I mean, I get the same thing from professors who do stints in China who come back and tell me that, like, it's totally different than it was 5 years ago, and the products that are now coming out of Chinese think tanks are indistinguishable from the propaganda, and that's different. There used to be a lot more space for a lot more discussion. That wasn't perfect, but it's much worse. And and as for the propaganda war, it's only going in one direction. That's towards more tension and more confrontation. They tried to have a cooling off. Remember the March 25th phone call between President Trump and President Xi, where they said, okay, I'll stop blaming you if you stop blaming me, and we'll try to figure this out. That was March 25th. It actually ended on April 14th when I published that Wuhan cable story, and then Pompeo confirmed it. And the Chinese side, I I believe, thought that that State Department leaked it, which wasn't true. It didn't actually come from the State Department at all. They wouldn't even comment. But it didn't matter because everyone just figured it did, because people don't understand, like, journalists actually have lots of different sources in lots of different places. And all of a sudden the propaganda war was back on, and that's where we are now.
Right, right. I wonder if you can comment on the story that that has achieved a great deal of traction among critics within the Trump administration, and that is the reassignment or the diminution in the number of people doing public health work in the embassy in Beijing at precisely the wrong moment, and what that actually signified. Some people said it was simply moving people around within a pre-existing organization. Others attributed it to a much larger sort of policy shift. What are your insights on this question? And
Yeah.
what do you think the significance of it was?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And, I spent a lot of time, especially after that, before and after that, I wrote that Wuhan cable story, talking to a lot of the scientists who were doing a lot of this work, and, and health officials and diplomats who were in Beijing and in Wuhan and in Yunnan scooping up bats. And, it's very clear if you listen to, first of all, it's important to note that there are many different parts of this, right? There are the health officials in Beijing who are the ones who went to Wuhan and wrote the cables and clearly thought that it was a risk. Then there's the USAID Predict program, which wasn't actually operating in Wuhan, but they were partners with Wuhan Institute of Virology, but most of their work happened in Southeast Asia or in Yunnan, again, where the bats were. They weren't in the lab, they were scooping up bats. Then you have guys like at the Eco Health Alliance and NIH who are funding a lot of this and, again, working on this. And it's undeniable and true that in the years and months leading up to the pandemic outbreak, that the Trump administration cut a bunch of these programs. They didn't renew the Predict program. It's called Predict. They're supposed to predict pandemics, and they canceled it. Now, you can't prove the other timeline that never existed, which is if they had continued it, would they have caught the virus? I mean, they only canceled it 2 months before the virus broke out. So, and they didn't, so in that 2 months, was that gonna make all the difference? I don't really think so, right? I don't think anyone can honestly say, well, if they had kept those CDC people in Beijing, then we would have had a lot more information, because the Chinese government was preventing the information to come out. You could have had 1,000 people in the CDC in Beijing, and if the Chinese government's lying about everything, then those 1,000 people are just they're not going to be able to crack that case any better than the 500 people or 20 people. One of the things the WHO always says is like, oh, well, we had a lot of interactions with U.S. officials. You'll see this in sort of leaked in a lot of different stories, but I keep seeing it. So, if you understand how leaks work, when you see the same data points in like lots of different articles, well, that's probably a reason for that. And the leak is from the WHO. It's like, oh, well, we had 17 meetings with U.S. officials in Beijing in January. And that's meant to tell us that, oh, they didn't do anything wrong and that they were cooperating and everything was hunky-dory. But the fact is that that's not the problem. The problem isn't the number of people on the ground or the number of meetings. The problem is the information that they were getting. The information was wrong, and maliciously so. Okay, so if the WHO was not scrutinizing the Chinese information properly and then passing on that information with their endorsement to US officials in 20 meetings or 30 or 100 meetings, well, that's just as egregious, because they're passing on terrible information, and that hurt our response. So yes, I think both things can be true. They cut and the same thing with that pandemic office and the NSC. Yeah, I get it. They had a pandemic office. Would it have been better if they had a pandemic office when the pandemic broke out? I think reasonable people can look at that and say, maybe, but it doesn't mean that they didn't have pandemic officials. So it's hard to extrapolate the bureaucratic nonsense from what really affected our public health and our response. And again, I just keep coming back to this point. It's like, if you're dealing with a government who's actively trying to hide and lie about the pandemic, well, isn't that the primary responsibility that needs to be assigned, rather than the fact that we had 4 people at the embassy instead of 6? That seems pretty clear to me.
Thank you.
Josh, the answer to your last question is simply yes, it is. And before I give the floor to Glenn to close, I just want to offer deep thanks from our project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region and from the Hoover Institution. You have certainly demonstrated in this last hour why you are now one of the leading thinkers and writers, not only about the U.S. China relationship and the whole kind of strategic interplay in the Indo-Pacific region, but why you're one of the leading voices in thinking about American foreign policy.
Well, listen, thanks for saying that. I think we're all trying to figure this out. You know, I think just amongst journalists, I was just a little bit earlier on the China issue, but I think we're all forced to deal with this. And of course, the reason that I know anything about it is because I spent the last 15 years talking to experts much smarter than me who had much more extensive experience, including you, Larry.
But you also have an analytic and normative lens that not everyone has. So thank you, Glenn.
Josh, yeah, I really want to thank you for taking the time to share your insightful commentary with us. Those are fantastic answers and a great discussion. I'd also like to thank the Hoover Special Events team, which works tirelessly behind the scenes to make this look easy. And on behalf of Larry and me, let me invite our audience to learn more about our project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region by visiting hoover.org. Our next public event will be on May 22nd, a research presentation by Dr. Dafydd Bell from the University of London on Taiwan's active sphere of political parties with origins in social movements. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.